Addressing Gettysburg.
Okay, we're going to have everybody's attention, and welcome to the lecture series here in the winter of 2024. The weather didn't cooperate so much last Saturday, but fortunately it has today. It's a little breezy out there, but it's sunny, and that's the best we can hope for in January. Thank you for coming out and supporting these. They're at 1:30 every Saturday and Sunday through early March. So take advantage of them being here and all the work that's gone into them. The one I'm going to present for you today will be the first time I've presented it. So I'm excited about it. The people were giving me thumbs up and good luck, Troy. And I said, I'm just going to enjoy myself. This is my favorite thing to do, is to be with you all and talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. It doesn't get any better. And you know, there are over 1,300 monuments and markers, statues, memorials, tablets, a signage on the battlefield. Gettysburg's the greatest outdoor collection of stone and metal art in the Western Hemisphere. That's including Inca and Aztec and Mayan ruins in terms of the amount of marble and granite and bronze that's around. And the park's been making a concerted effort over the last several years to try to emphasize the art more. We have the beautiful cyclorama that the Gettysburg Foundation presents daily. That's a beautiful piece of art, one of the 3 largest paintings in North America. And then we have all these monuments. And some of the most famous artists, there's some seats right down here in the middle if you're just walking in. Some of the most famous artists in American history were commissioned to do the artwork on the battlefield, like Gutzen Borglund, who did Mount Rushmore, also did the North Carolina Memorial. And if you go back and look at the places that these people studied that produced this artwork, at some of the finest institutions in the world, in Paris and Italy, and this battlefield's covered with just beautiful works of art. So in an hour's time, there's no way that you could do anything comprehensive. But I'm trying to look at it, at the artwork on the battlefield from the standpoint of how the heavens meet earth and mortality and the connection between someone's life here and then their lasting memory, and how the monuments represent that. It's not so much about, I may here and there mention this is made of limestone, or this is made of granite, or this is a bronze relief, but that'll be in passing. The emphasis is on the deeper meaning. And so the agenda then specifically is, the goal here is to identify the embedded immortality messages found in Gettysburg monument design. There's an old adage, Ken, we were talking about this a few weeks ago. There's an old adage that a person's influence is never truly gone as long as they are remembered. That's an underlying message in all the monuments. You've heard that before. As long as someone utters your name, you're still with us to some degree. And so think of the monuments that way, rather than just that they mark a position where a regiment stood for a moment in time. They also represent wanting to be remembered. Our humans' 2 greatest fears, according to repeated surveys, are the fear of death and then the fear of never having mattered. That's why a book like Purpose-Driven Life or Be You immediately goes New York Times bestseller if it's well written, because it goes to that second greatest fear that we have. We want to find our purpose in life. That's what a midlife crisis is all about, is finding your purpose, realizing that you're getting not any younger and you still are not doing what you were meant to do. So think of the monuments that way, as meeting that basic fear and need of wanting to be remembered and never forgotten, and your name continually uttered. Now today in modern society, we look down. We take our cell phones, our smartphones, our smartwatches, and we look down for the time, for the weather, for our news, and we're constantly looking down. If you go into a venue where there's a lot of people gathered, many of them are stumbling over each other looking down, or at street corners looking down. Ancient people looked up. They looked up. So their landscape places on earth reflected what they saw in the heavens. In ancient times, and really all the way up through the time before Edison and Tesla, there were no street lamps to wash out the night sky. So you could look up and it was crystal clear. I was on a mountain once on a wildland fire in the early 1990s out west, and it was called Goat Mountain. We were 8,000 feet above elevation, and I've never seen the stars that thick in my life. Well, prior to modern lighting, it was that way everywhere. And so people were looking up, not down. And so it allowed them to tell what time of the year it was. And we have our festivals and holidays today, July 4th and Memorial Day and Martin Luther King birthday, and many events on the calendar where we stop and celebrate, commemorate, remember. In ancient times, and really all the way up through the time of the Civil War, the important times of the year were measured by whether it was time to plant or to harvest, whether it was time to come out into a gathering and acknowledge some period of the year around a holy structure that was built to bring people together. Just in passing, it's not our focus, but the three pyramids at Giza, one of the original 7 ancient wonders of the world, aligns with the 3 stars in the belt of Orion, Orion the hunter. And the 3 stars there that you see in a row tightly across that look like a belt, the 3 pyramids of Giza were built to align with that. And that's true of a lot of temples and megaliths and monuments across the world. People were looking up, and so they designed sacred spaces below to align with it, because they were not looking down at their smartphones. They were constantly looking up. And so we're going to look at how Gettysburg, before the cell phone, before the smartphone, the smart watch, before electricity, in some cases, some of the monuments were put there after electricity. But certainly the lighting wasn't to the degree that it is today. In any case, we're going to look at how these monuments reflected an awareness of above and how they point towards immortality. So we start with the Soldiers' National Monument in the cemetery, where over 3,500 Union soldiers are buried and over 6,400 soldiers altogether, counting the various wars that the United States has participated in. And the centerpiece in the Civil War section is the Soldiers' National Monument. It was one of the first national monuments ever put up. Many of you have heard me say this if you've been with me on programs, that no one used the word nation on a regular basis prior to the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln was the first president in public to say that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, referring to the country as a nation. The word nation had been used before, but never in the modern sense of what we think in terms of nation. And after Lincoln uttered those words, we use the word nation quite frequently today. National health care and National Weather Service and National Public Radio and national parks and national cemeteries, national monuments, national football. Prior to the Gettysburg Address, using nation that way would not have been a common thing. You instead referred to your nation as your state. And the idea of, I hadn't planned to mention this to you, but in Lincoln's original inaugural address in 1861, in March of 61, he referred to our country as a union over 22 times. He did not use the word nation until the Gettysburg Address, because he saw Gettysburg as a defining moment in the Civil War where the country had shifted from a union to a nation. From, let's say, think of the European Economic Union. And you go up to somebody from France or Germany today and say, hey, you're from France, or you're not from France or Germany, you're from the European Union. They would say, yes, but we're French or German first, and we belong to this union for economic reasons, and trade, commerce, and mutual protection, but we're French or German first, and we belong to the European Union. In a similar way, the states saw themselves before the Civil War as countries that belonged to a union. The significance of Gettysburg from Lincoln's perspective is Gettysburg represents where the country shifted from a union to a nation. And so that's what happened here. That's why Gettysburg is so significant for many reasons. But if you look at the Soldiers' National Monument, then it's a national monument. That in itself is a novelty. It's a national monument. It's not a Union monument. And You could have been dedicated to the Union soldiers in the Union Army and been called a Union monument. It's called a national monument. And there are 18 stars. That represents the 18 states that are represented, buried in the National Cemetery in the Civil War section. There are 4 corners forming a square. Squares represent the earth. And I'll expand on that as we move along here. But 18 stars represents not only literally the 18 states that are represented in the National Cemetery Civil War section, but they represent the cosmos. Notice at ground level, the 4 figures seated are on the earth. And notice that standing on a globe above them is liberty. So she's elevated. They're on earth, she's in the heavens. Why? Because liberty is a higher ideal that we aim to live up to, just like freedom, just like courage, just like trust, just like justice. These are called virtues. Liberty is a muse. Muse, we get the word museum from it, an amusement park. In ancient Greece, muses gave inspiration to literature, to history, and to language, and there were muses for all the above. Seated at the base of this monument on your right is a muse to history, but there were muses to language, to the arts, the literary arts, and all variations of arts. They're on the ground level, they're on the earth. Liberty is in the heavens because she's a higher ideal that people on earth are trying to ascend to, that they are appealing to, that they're trying to reach. And so there's liberty. There were many variations on liberty in the 1800s. Prior to Ellis Island and the standard Lady Liberty that we're familiar with, there were many Lady Liberties. Did you know one of the early liberties in the late 1790s, early 1800s was a Native American woman? So there were different variations on what liberty was. But liberty is a higher ideal represented by a muse that we aspire to. And so she's elevated in the heavens above the 18 stars in the cosmos. On ground level are war, history, plenty, and peace. And you can see on the far left, war. Now, in a traditional sense, war would be represented by Mars. Mars would have a brush helmet and a cape. And that's a classical view of Mars. But this is neoclassicism. How many of you are familiar with neoclassicism? Late 19th century, very, very popular. Downtown New York City, downtown Indianapolis, Cleveland, New York City, all have examples of neoclassicism. Washington, D.C.'s monuments are neoclassicism for the most part. Neoclassicism merges past and present, then and now, to conflate the past and the present so that people in the present can draw by association credibility in the present from the past. So, for instance, the Lincoln Memorial. The Lincoln Memorial, the oversized Lincoln in the oversized chair is Zeus in an oversized chair in his temple at Mount Olympus. And that's what the Lincoln Memorial is. It's conflating Zeus with Lincoln. Why? So Lincoln in the present, it draws a godlike status. Another example, the Washington Monument is neoclassicism. The neo means new. Classicism means the ancient Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians, the Mycenae, the Hittites, the Assyrians. That conflating of the two, the merging of the past and the present to gain credibility in the present. Americans wanted to do that in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, because America was a young fledgling nation. Not like it's been post-World War II. America was not a major player on the world stage in the late 19th century. So merging its image in public art with ancient great civilizations bumped up the United States and made it more credible. And so that's why you see such monuments. But look at the Washington Monument. It's a tall obelisk. And it's It's inspired by ancient Egyptian obelisk, quite possibly the one to Ramesses II, which is front of the Pantheon in Rome today. The Romans took a lot of the obelisk away from Egypt and transported them all throughout their empire, and they're all over Europe today. But why would George Washington's image be conflated with an Egyptian pharaoh? It's for George Washington to be associated with great pharaohs in antiquity, and therefore in the present or relative present, his image is heightened. That's neoclassicism. The battlefield's covered with neoclassicism. So in a classical sense, this monument, the Soldiers' National Monument, one of the first national monuments, should be in a classic robe with a brush helmet. And instead, a modern Civil War soldier is plugged in. That would be like putting out a classical monument today with Greek gods and goddesses and muses, and mixing in with it someone who fought in Afghanistan 5 years ago or 15 years ago. And it would stand out. You would think, why is that person in khakis mixed with people with robes? And that's neoclassicism, merging past and present and gaining prestige in the present where prestige maybe is missing. Now, the four figures, some of you heard me say this before, and I'll move quickly here, but some of you have never heard this before, so it's important to put these foundational points out. Four to the ancients, to the ancient classics, Rome, Greece, Egypt. Four was, particularly Rome and Greece, was the number of the earth. They believed there were four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. Four fluids in the body: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, said Hippocrates of the Hippocratic Oath. There were four corners of the earth, or 4 points of the weather vane. 4 seasons in a year. And you can go on and on with that. There are 4 types of poetry. 4 is the number of the earth. So what we have here is 4 figures representing the earth. Anytime you see represented in a monument, whether it's in the middle of a city or on a battlefield, Vicksburg, Antietam, Gettysburg, if you see 4 corners at the base, or you're in downtown Trafalgar Square in London and you see a monument and it has 4 figures at the base and they're animals of various sorts on each corner, that means the earth. If you have ears to hear and eyes to see, it means the earth. But we said that above that in the heavens is liberty. She's above the earth. So, and circles always represent the heavens. She's on a globe. Notice how she's flying above the earth. She's a higher ideal that people on earth are trying to appeal to. What's really going on here is that the soldiers that are buried in the National Cemetery fought for a higher ideal. And so they reached immortality. They fought for the freedom of others. The Soldiers' National Cemetery. It's elliptical fan shape. William Saunders designed the cemetery, and it's in an elliptical fan shape. Circles represent the heavens. They are the symbols of eternity, perfection, and equality. So let me go a little deeper into this. William Saunders said that he just took out his compass and he drew a half circle. He wanted simple grandeur. I was talking with my wife, who's an art professor, and she's here today, and we talked about this before, that there was no word called minimalism back then. But really, simple grandeur is a term that William Saunders used that we would call minimalism today. Minimalism is less is more. Have you ever been into a studio, a gallery? The walls are white, there's white tracking lights, there's a high ceiling, there's maybe one couch, there's no back on the couch, possibly one throw rug, and a wood-stained floor. You think, this is pretty bare. But a minimalist is petrified at the thought of clutter. If they add one extra piece to that room, it's going to look cluttered, and that's their worst nightmare. So we might call William Saunders looking back. It's called upstreaming when you take a modern term and apply it to the past, but we maybe would call him a minimalist today. He would metaphorically roll over in his grave to know that there's a monument, that there are monuments out there, like the one to General Collis and his bust in the Pennsylvania section, and the Minnesota urn. These are beautiful monuments. The New York State Monument. These are beautiful monuments in the National Cemetery. but they added to the simple grandeur that he was attempting. And those monuments came later, mainly because the National Cemetery operated separate from the National Park here, and it had to fulfill its own budget, and it allowed things to be built in the cemetery long after Saunders' original plan to raise revenue. So as you look at the half circle, circles represent eternity, perfection, and equality. We're doing history at a higher level when we do comparative methods. So what's the opposite of a circle? Let's go with a rectangle. This past Thanksgiving, you sat down possibly at a rectangle table. Well, someone, whether they wanted to or not, had to sit at the head of the table because rectangles denote inequality. If you've ever seen an organizational chart, there's a CEO at the top, and then there are a series of brackets all the way down. Any of you have done NCAA bracketology? You start with 68 teams, you end with 1. It's not equality because rectangles do not denote equality. Circles, in contrast, denote equality. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, you don't know who's sitting at the head of the table. That's the point of circles. So you have equality there, and you have perfection. Circles are considered perfect. Squares and rectangles have 4 corners or 4 imperfections. Circles, there's no imperfection. Also, circles denote eternity. We're talking about heavens meet earth here at Gettysburg, eternity. With squares and rectangles, you have 4 starting and stopping points. With circles, there's no beginning and no end. So these are messages that are embedded into the design. Also, the soldiers are buried within that fan elliptical shape with their feet pointing away from the Soldiers' National Monument. They have footstones, not headstones. Did you know that? If you were to go out and do an X-ray of whatever the molecular remains there of the soldiers in the Civil War section, you would find that where their name is, their head is not abutted up against their name. Actually, their feet are. And that's so that, and this is our heavens and earth thought process, it's so that one day, and this was the ideological thinking of William Saunders, that one day a trumpet will sound, the dead will rise first, and then the living after them. When the dead are caught up, their physical remains are reunited with their soul in the sky. There's a full resurrection. And Saunders, with that ideology in mind, buried the soldiers in a way where when they rose up, they would rise up on their names when that trumpet sounded. They could look down at their names, and then as they were caught up, because of the shape of the cemetery, they would have a panoramic view of the battlefield where they perfected themselves for eternity by fighting for human freedom. You think, oh my goodness, that was part of the design. I could give you more examples. But the Soldiers' National Cemetery then is if you have ears to hear and eyes to see and you're able to discern, it's a direct connection between the heavens and the earth. The U.S. Regular Monument. I mentioned earlier the obelisk. I said that we would mention some information up front that would add to the specifics along the way. And here's an example. The U.S. Regular Monument is one of many obelisks on the battlefield. I've never counted up how many obelisks there are. There are many, many, many obelisks, and they don't all look classical. Some of them are more rounded and take on various shapes. Some of them have soldiers on top of them walking along, but if you look closely, they're obelisks. And obelisks were ancient sundials. They told you the time. So if you look at my shadow, for instance, some of you can look down and see my shadow now. To someone living at the time of the Civil War or before that, that told them what time of day it was. And if the shadow was really long, it told them what time of the year it was. The longest that the shadow is at 12 noon on December 21st. So that's because there's a certain point in the sky at noon where the sun is just right and it'll hit someone laterally and the shadow carries a long ways. That's the whole groundhog idea groundhog goes into hibernation early winter And then sometime in February, he comes out, and the idea is, does he see his shadow? Well, the shadow gets shorter and shorter and shorter as you go from the winter equinox on December 21st to the summer equinox, where the shadow's the shortest on June 21st, because the sun's more directly higher in the sky, the closer in relation to the 23.5 degree axis of the Earth. So if he sees his shadow, it means it's long, which means winter's probably going to be longer. And the U.S. regular monument then is an ancient sundial. All up and down the Nile River in 2500 BC, there were obelisks built. Not only, kind of like highway markers are today on I-95 to tell you what your exit is. They told you what part of the Nile, upper, lower Nile you were based on where the obelisk was. It was some recognizable landmark, but it also told you what time of the day it was. And I'll add this as a side note. Civil War soldiers, many of them didn't have clocks. You could buy, Waltham, Massachusetts was making a pocket watch for $13 that the sutlers sold. Not everybody could afford them. And then you wind it up, and then it would run out, and you would forget to wind it up again. That's why the timing is all over the place with the battle accounts. There's one guide here that insists that the second day of the battle, Longstreet's attack started closer to 5 o'clock, whereas we traditionally say 4 o'clock. He's convinced that it was 5 o'clock. And the way that you can have those kinds of arguments is because a Civil War soldier is looking at a shadow cast by a tree and then writing down roughly what time it is. And so they're all 15 or 20 minutes. So people kept time through these sundials. And the original word for obelisk is a Greek word, but the original Egyptian word was tekhenu, which means to pierce the sky. So what are you trying to do? My theme's heavens meet earth at Gettysburg. What do obelisks do? They draw the heavens down to the earth in the form of a shadow. So you're drawing shadows down from the heavens onto the earth. I want you, when you leave here today, to see those connections. We don't want to look down at our cell phones all the time. Look up and you're going to see those connections. And I'm going to continue to describe them. Cathedral steeples, Gothic spires were inspired by Egyptian obelisks. Have you ever wondered where the church steeple came from? It came from the obelisk, which the Egyptians introduced. And during the Middle Ages, the Knights Templars were, during the Crusades, late 1000s, 1100s, early 1200s, were over in the Near East and the Middle East. And they also, as they moved through the Middle East, they ran across all kinds of artifacts related to not only the Middle East and the Near East, but also Egypt. And so those ideas found their way into Masonic art and found their way all the way into popular culture. But in the 19th century, there was something called Gothic Revival. How many of you knew the National Cathedral in Washington, which is Gothic Revival, was built in the 19th century? Or how many of you have been to West Point or seen pictures of it? And you think, my goodness, they built a castle in the 1820s. Why would they build a castle? Because in the 1820s, Gothic Revival was around. Have you ever seen Big Ben in Parliament? It's made after a medieval cathedral. Why build something in the 1800s that looks like a medieval cathedral? This fascination with Gothic, everything to do with castles. The chivalric code made its way back through the Victorian code, and Sir Walter Scott was writing in his diaries all about knights in shining armor and so forth. So people in the 19th century were very interested in Gothic. That's why they wore what looked like dark tuxedos and top hats. In the 1980s, I had a 3/4 length overcoat that I wore. I watched St. Elmo's Fire, and then I wore that, and that was Gothic. And I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons, but some people did. Gothic comes back at different times. It was really popular in the 19th century, and so you go to a college campus, and there are all these buildings that look like medieval buildings on campus. Many of them were built in the middle 1800s. That's why your monuments on the battlefield look like castles. That's why there's so many castle-looking monuments on the battlefield, or monuments that look like they have parapets and rock carvings. It's this interesting Gothic. It was very popular. So Gothic Revival means taking the Middle Ages and bringing them back to the present. And cathedral steeples were taking this Middle Ages fascination with Egypt and bringing it back. The fourth main is another obelisk. We could put up many examples, but obelisks mark a moment and place in time. So what the fourth main, who was under Elijah Walker, are really telling you by their monument is there was a moment, a place, and a time when we stood here, or very near here. So the meaning of that monument is time. You think, oh, it means the fourth main, but it means time. They're communicating time to you, that they existed in a moment of time. They mattered. They had purpose. And those who came back for the dedication were thinking about those who they had lost. Drawing down shadows again from the heavens, that's bringing the heavens down to earth. Gothic spires then, as we've said, are inspired by Egyptian obelisk. Hopefully you'll never see a church steeple or a cathedral spire the same way again. The Pennsylvania Memorial, it has its squares and its circles. Squares mean the what? Earth. So north, south, east, and west. Spring, summer, winter, and fall. Earth, wind, fire, and water. And then the circle at the top, the globe, that means the what? Heavens. Heavens meet earth. And flying above the heavens is the winged goddess of victory, Nike. And she's made with melted down Union cannons. But the idea is she's flying above the globe. Now the curvature dome that you see at the top, that represents the earth that she's flying over. But it also represents the Pantheon. If you go inside and look inside the Pantheon at the ceiling, or that is inside the Pennsylvania Memorial at the ceiling, you'll see riveted into the stone ocaluses. Ocaluses are, in this case, plates that have been riveted in, metal plates that look like carvings into the stone to give definition and artistic appearance to the ceiling of the dome. If you look at those ocaluses and compare them to the real Pantheon in Rome, the oldest standing dome in the world, over 2,000 years old, it's the same carvings. It's clear that the Pennsylvania Memorial Dome is inspired by the Pantheon. Now why did the Pennsylvania Memorial has plates that are carved in that look like flower-like carvings that we call ocaluses, and they're dotted like the measles all inside the dome of the Pennsylvania Memorial. But why did the original Pantheon in Rome, built by the Romans, why were the ocaluses or flower-like designs carved into the stone? Not only for artwork, but there's something structural going on there. To make the dome lighter, by removing stone through carving, you were making the dome lighter so it wouldn't collapse. That's why it's still standing 2,000 years later. But the Pennsylvania Memorial actually has riveted metal plates that resemble the carvings that appear in the original dome at the Pantheon. So Pantheon means all holy. The original Pantheon in Rome, it's believed, was originally built over a burial site of some of the greatest people of that time in Rome. And so here we have presented, this is not a burial site, but here we have presented some of the greatest leaders here at Gettysburg related to the Gettysburg campaign, depicted stoically all the way around the monument. So the Pantheon means all holy. This is a holy site. It's a very special site. When we're talking holy, we're talking about eternity. And we have an angel of victory flying above. Now, the four archways that you see, ancient Rome was known for archways. The Colosseum is built with archways. You know that. The aqueducts were built with archways. If you ever look at a Volkswagen Beetle, Bug, it's curved. That's the strongest structure that you trust. and a roof is the strongest structure you can make. If it points up, it's hard to invert it and push it down. When something is pointed up like a Volkswagen, it's hard to invert it and dimple it. So the Romans, all this went away, and that type of building went away in the 1860s when the Bessemer converter was built. And Carnegie used them out near Pittsburgh, but it's a big cauldron pot, and it takes metal and heats it to a temperature never seen before prior to 1863 when it was invented. And it got so hot that impurities would be smelted and they would float to the top, and puddlers would scrape them off, and you could get impurities out and make a stronger metal. It's called steel. That's why you start to see steel cage construction in skyscrapers, high rises, and then skyscrapers by the 1900s. All the New York City and Chicago, just one skyscraper after another. That's steel cage construction. But for most of history, there was no steel cage construction because there wasn't steel. So you couldn't build more than just 3 or 4 stories up without everything collapsing on itself. That's why the pyramids are built from wide to very narrow, because the taller you get, the heavier it gets. If you tried to keep building the same width at the top, it would collapse on the bottom. So the Romans found a tricky way to build up high with their Colosseum. They used that archway that points up, and it allowed them to build up at a time when other civilizations were struggling with that. It was a great innovation. And then the Romans used that as a sign of their strength to depict their great military victories all up and down the Mediterranean after they would win a great victory in some part of the world, the Near East, the Middle East, Africa. Their army would come home on ships, and then they would have a 4th of July celebration or a Veterans Day, and they would march through the streets, and people were given wine and bread and olive oil, and they burned incense, and the prisoners were taken through the streets, and people would throw cabbage and vegetables at them. But usually all of this was crowned by an archway, which was the structural symbol of Rome, being unveiled, and a commissioned work of art along the frieze celebrating the latest great victory of Rome. They're all over Europe, which was the Western and Eastern Roman Empire. These archways, if you look at them closely, they're inspired by the archways to the Emperor Titus. His archway was found by archaeologists early 1800s outside of the Colosseum. Same exact angels. If you go up and look at it closer today, there are angels on either side of the curve of the archway entrance. Same exact design. What does an archway mean? Victory, military victory. So if you have ears to hear and eyes to see, there's 4 archways. On one side of the archway is depicted the infantry, another, the artillery, a third, the signal corps, and then 4th, the cavalry. So in 4 directions of the compass, the monument's communicating to you that in 4 directions of the compass, Pennsylvania brought victory to the Union Army with 4 different branches of service: cavalry, infantry, artillery, and the signal corps. And you have Nike, she also means victory. So you have 4 archways that stand for victory, and you have Nike crowning the top, who represents victory. So if you're tuned into the right frequency, 24/7, 365, when you go past the monument, it's saying victory, 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 victory. Victory, 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 victory. Victory, 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 victory. It might as well be an electronic sign. That's what it's saying. It has 34,000 names on it of Pennsylvanians that serve. So she's flying right there at the heavens. And to ancient people, there are 3 kinds of heavens. There's the immediate heavens above you. We would call them ionosphere, stratosphere, hemisphere. But then there were the heavens, which is the universe. And then there was heavens where they believed they would go hereafter. There were 3 heavens. We're looking really at all 3 of them today. Eternal Peace Light. It's a unification monument dedicated in 1938. Franklin Roosevelt spoke. There were other speakers. 250,000 people estimated to be here. It's the last great reunion, the 75th anniversary of the Civil War, not unlike what was held at D-Day a few years ago. And it's made with Maine granite and Alabama dolomite limestone. to represent the merge of the north and the south. And the column that you see there is pointing upward. Now take a close look at the picture, take a picture of it in your mind, and then compare it with the lighthouse at Alexandria, Egypt. This is neoclassicism. And one of the original 7 ancient wonders of the world was the lighthouse at Alexandria. An earthquake took it out many centuries ago. It no longer exists. But what do lighthouses do? The original lighthouse at Alexandria that inspired the one here, the neoclassical design here, was built with a real bonfire, and there was copper used to reflect it out to sea so that ships would know how close they were to shore and wouldn't run aground and be damaged. And the one we have today is Columbia Gas, and and we know when it's out because there's a strange smell, and we get a report over the radio that there's something going on up there and we can't see the flame, and we run and fix it real quick. But the idea of the lighthouse at Alexandria, I'm looking for deeper meanings here today. Immortality, heavens meet the earth. We're trying to look deeper at these 1,300 monuments and markers. We can barely scratch the surface in the time we have. But as we look at the lighthouse at Alexandria, what's the real message of the eternal peace light? It's that the nation would never be shipwrecked again. So that's the meaning of it. That's why you can see that flame at the Peace Light Memorial 3 miles away. If you're tuned into the right frequency, it's not yelling victory 5 times. It's yelling, this is an eternal commitment to never let this happen again. And we're merging dolomite limestone from Alabama, granite from Maine. It's there, and as long as it's burning, we still have that promise. And as you look at it closer, you can't help but mention the neoclassicism. There's the Egyptian tale of the 2 ladies. In ancient Egypt, there was a story of the upper Nile and the lower Nile being represented by women. Just like women represent many countries. Britannia, there's Lady Britannia, Lady Germania, Lady Liberty here in this country. Women represent those virtues, have in statues across time and space. In Egypt, there's a lady that represents the upper Nile and the lower Nile. And they're walking arm in arm. The message is very clear that the north and south in Egypt is unified, just as the north and south in the United States is now unified again. And I want to make a transition from there to the flame itself. On top of the Eternal Peace Light Memorial is a flame. Flames represent the connection between heaven and earth. Flames mean eternity. How many of you knew that? It means something. If you've gone to John F. Kennedy's Eternal Flame, by the way, that idea came from the Eternal Peace Light Memorial, which inspired it. John and Jackie Kennedy were here in 1962. Jackie contacted the park after John's death, talked to the superintendent, got the specs on the Eternal Peace Light Memorial here at Gettysburg, and that was used as information to create the Eternal Flame at Arlington for John F. Kennedy. But anytime you have something burning, it brings warmth, light, purification. It's earth, wind, fire, and water. It was one of the original 4 elements. It has transformative powers. You can burn something and it changes in composition. To ancient people, really all the way up to the Civil War. Even now, we love to sit in front of a fireplace. Strength and divinity. So as long as that fire is burning, you have each one of those things. I know people that have sat around that couldn't get along. I've read about this before, where they decided to go into a room, all write down on a note what they wanted to say, and they just remained quiet. And then they put it in a can, covered the can, set fire to it, burned it. My father was involved in administration, and he was the organization he was with paid off a building, and he had a burning ceremony, and people came out and they burned the debt once it was paid off, and it was just a symbolic way of saying this is gone. Fire purifies; it purifies, and it means eternal. And the Zoroastrians, you've heard the Magi, and they saw the star and they walked to Bethlehem. Magi, it took them a year to get there. That story in the New Testament is of the Magi were royal priest of Persia, and their faith was the Zoroaster faith. So it's one of the, there's a fire over there that they lit in 721. Apparently it has not gone out since 721, and they keep it burning because it's an eternal commitment to their faith. The eternal peace light, notice this neoclassical, I can't help but mention, some people have asked me before, what are those four figures there? Is that Atlas? No, those four figures are four falcons. Because one of the ancient symbols of Egypt was the falcon god, Horus. The reason for that is the ancient Egyptian story of the flood, the ancient flood, was, and we often talk about it with Noah, but other civilizations have a similar story, that as soon as the first land was visible, a falcon flew and landed on the land and showed that the waters were parting and that there was land. That's one of the theories for why the pyramids are also built pointed up, is to represent that moment when the land first shone through the water. And so anyway, you've got these Egyptian motifs going on. Oh, I want to mention one more thing. Fragrances. Heavens and earth. Heavens and earth. Ancient people, whether it was a polytheistic religion or whether it's a monotheistic religion, they believed that the gods in polytheism, for instance, did not have intestines and stomachs and they didn't have taste buds, palates. They couldn't eat and digest food. But you could sacrifice an animal and send up the fragrance, and the fragrance was sweet to them, and they could comprehend it that way. So that's part of the ancient sacrificial system across many civilizations. And so the flame then has to do, that's why you have incenses. For instance, you go to a cathedral and they're spreading incense. Smoke rises to the heavens, just like obelisks draw shadows to the ground. You're trying to make connections between heaven and earth. You go to the gatehouse at the National Cemetery here at Gettysburg, and there is an eternal flame there. Probably means eternal memory of the soldier's sacrifice here at Gettysburg. The gatehouse eagles on the Baltimore Street side of the National Cemetery also are symbolically important of heavens and earth. The eagles are perched on globes. This means they're flying above the earth. And eagles represent pride, victory, leadership, divinity, loyalty, leadership, and determination. And when you think about an eagle, it catches your attention. Everybody wants to come out and see it. No, there's not. Yes, there's actually an eagle up there because they're so special and so distinct, and they represent divinity, this connection between heaven and earth. They're bigger than life. They represent independence and determination and strength. Freedom. They represent freedom. The SPQR, that's on a lot of ancient Roman monuments. And it means the Senate and the Q means and. Senate and the people of Rome. If you ever translate Latin, I had 4 years of Latin. The words are never in the exact order. You have to go back and substitute words that are at the end of our sentence and put them in the middle of the sentence. But it translated SPQR is Senate and the people of Rome. Early Republic Romans, that's before Julius Caesar and before Augustus Caesar, really in the Empire of Rome. The early Republic, based on the law of the 12 tables and equality between the plebes and the patricians, early Republic Romans believed all authority is derived from the people, and the eagle is symbolic of that. Did you know when the Romans went into battle, they carried a standard? That is, they held up a pole with an eagle on the top of it. Ben Franklin, I used to work at Independence Hall in the 1980s where the Declaration of Independence was signed. And there were debates involving Ben Franklin and the founders on what should be the national bird. And early on they were talking about a turkey. And eventually it was suggested, I think it was Franklin that wanted the turkey. But eventually it was agreed upon, and they were thinking back to the Romans and what the eagle stands for. They were thinking about the eagle, and it's now our national symbol. Has been since the late 1700s. The 27th Connecticut, right about where Lieutenant Colonel Henry Merwin was killed with Brooks Brigade on the second day of the battle in the famous wheat field. Notice they did the 27th Connecticut, the two companies that were there. Notice how they chose to mark that spot with an eagle. And among the many adjectives that we can use and verbs and so forth, the eagle means majestic and bold and independent. An eagle is not subject to anything or anybody. An eagle is independent. So notice when you go out there then that there are eagles flying above the battlefield on various monuments. That's your connection between heavens and earth. Then there's the 6th New York Cavalry. Did you know that the monument here above, the top part of the 6th New York Cavalry, near the Peace Light Memorial, First Day's Battlefield, Buford's Cavalry, did you know that it's to represent the Ark of the Covenant? And the Ark of the Covenant was in the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem. And the priests could only go behind the curtain that was decorated with seraphims and cherubim angels once a year, with all of the, essentially all of the sins of the people that were given to the priest. He would take them behind a curtain. And there were 2 goats. One goat would have whispered in his ear all of the sins of the country that had been reported. That one time of the Day of Atonement. This is a day to make everything right and forgiveness. And then that goat was taken out into the wilderness, never to be seen again. That's where we get the idea of the scapegoat. And then the other goat was told everything, and he was sacrificed. And there was a bowl on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, in the original Ark of the Covenant, where the blood from the goat would spill in, and then it would be sprinkled around. It was the idea that lifeblood cleansed the nation's sins. The Ark of the Covenant was even taken into battle at different times. It was, the Old Testament talks about how you could get electrocuted if you touched it. And now a lightning struck this in October 9th, 2007. How many of you remember that? Jim's been around long enough, he remembers that. And it was struck, and you go on the internet and look it up, you can still see pictures of it. It was damaged and it was scaffolded. And when it cracked open, it revealed a time capsule on the inside. And the word was, and I never heard an update on this, that they wouldn't dare touch the time capsule. It was just too spooky that lightning would strike that monument and reveal a time capsule. That was just, and in any case, it's been repaired. Now, what are time capsules? Well, I was reading up on where somewhere between 10 and 15,000 monuments worldwide have time capsules in them, but they don't know how accurate that is. Some of the monuments that were removed in 2020, 2021, they found time capsules in them. And we don't know how many monuments on this battlefield have time capsules, but here and there, we stumble onto an account where there's a time capsule. Now, why would you do a time capsule? Time, this is a psychological point. We're talking about mortality, immortality, wanting to be remembered, heavens and earth in all ways, shapes, and form. We all feel bound by time. You're daily bound by time. The clock's ticking away even on our life. And your schedule, and some of you are thinking, I've got this and that to do when I leave this lecture, because the clock's always ticking. And so time can almost be a prison. By the way, people didn't keep time in ancient time like we do. Do you know that people didn't start keeping time until around 300, what we would call 300 BC, under Alexander the Great? It was about that time. Prior to that, if you go back and read ancient accounts prior to 300 BC, it's always under King Zered or King Hill or what have you, and they lived in the time of a king, and it might last 40 years, but they didn't say it was AD or it was BC. That doesn't start until Jesus. So from that point on, we start to keep time, and from that point on, then there's the messianic aspects of when is time going to end? Is it going to end in some catastrophic way? It's on our mind because we're bound by time. And we're also bound by time. Sometimes an environment may not be conducive to expressing yourself. Maybe you feel you're in an environment where you can't express yourself. When you put a time capsule there and a monument, you know that someone later is going to read it. You're speaking to someone outside of your time. So it's a way of escaping time. People who write journals, people who write memoirs do that. They know they're writing to the future. Medical doctors, we have volumes downstairs in our archives of, over in that direction, of doctors during the Civil War who wrote down symptoms. The skin turned yellow. This is the kind of seepage that came out of his ears. And they don't know what the person who's dying is dying of, but they're writing to future medical doctors who will have solved the riddle and know what it was. They're writing to people that they can't communicate with, and that's what a time capsule is. The 86 New York monument over on Houck's Ridge near Devil's Den, this unit was organized at Elmira, New York. They fought with Hobart Ward's brigade. They chose to put on their monument the Republican Mother and the Good Death. If you study women's studies, you know that women in the early 1800s in many places couldn't own property or couldn't vote. And so women, the academics would call women of the late 1700s and early 1800s as the Republican mother motif. Republican mother motif is you raise sons who can go out and live in a world you wished you could live in, but you're not able to now, so you train them up. And then you live vicariously through them. And so that happened on battlefields where soldiers would die and their thoughts of mom were the last thoughts. You've heard that before. You know the most common cries on a battlefield even today. When a soldier's wounded and he's hemorrhaging and he knows his time's coming up, he yells, "Water," because you're always thirsty when you're injured. Whether it's a surgery, an intended or an unintended injury, you're always thirsty. The second thing you call out for is for 19, 20-year-old soldiers. They yell out, "Mom, Mom." It's because they're losing their blood and things are becoming darker in their subconscious. And it's likened to when they were 9 years of age and they woke up with a bad dream. "Mom, Mom." So here she's lived vicariously through him and she's yielding him to his country and to his God. It's also the idea of the good death of if you die good here and you perfect your death, there's a better chance of going to eternity. I'd like to go more into this theme. I'll say this real quick just to interject it. Some of you may have not heard it before. There was a restlessness and anxiety after the Protestant Reformation, 1500, 1600, 1700, all the way up to the time of the Civil War, because the Protestant Reformation entered the idea that purgatory may not exist. And calling into question purgatory means you can't do anything after you die to get to a good place. So you better die perfect here because there's nothing that can be done hereafter. So how did that affect Victorians? They were the first to set up funeral parlors. They took their parlors, the first modern people to embalm with arsenic. You know, Lincoln embalmed Willie with arsenic and formaldehyde they would use sometimes. Seal the person up in a casket with a glass window so you could see their face. Cover in their parlor, cover the room with flowers. That's to cover the smells, and that's where the idea of a parlor, funeral parlor, came from. The Victorian parlor. What were they trying to do? Perfect the person after they died. And there are many more examples. Have you ever gone into an old Victorian cemetery and you see huge stone slabs over the graves? That was to make sure that a grave robber couldn't go in later and take the body and take it to let's say Harvard Medical College. It was illegal to operate on cadavers then, but there was a system where after a funeral, people were paid a fee to exhume that body, take them in a side door into an anatomy school. Students would operate on the body, put them back before sunrise. And Victorian, that's 19th century people in the West, got hold of this idea, and so those who could afford it bought big slabs to cover their graves so that no one could get into their graves after they died. They were worried that if they moved around their organs, even in the name of science in a lab, it would, the deceased person or the people who were caring for the deceased person feared that it would compromise them being perfect to enter the hereafter. When I got my driver's license renewed recently, the the DMV asked me, do you want to be an organ donor? And I said, yes. And they said, are you sure? I said, yes, just make sure that I'm gone first. I'm not worried about that affecting making it to eternity. I don't have to die the perfect death and have be embalmed and all of those things. Now, the 116th Pennsylvania is an artistic variation on the good death. You've heard of St. Clair Mulholland and the 116th Pennsylvania, and they fought along what is out in front of Ayr Sickles Avenue, just on the western border of the wheat field. And if you look at the monument up close, it's really fascinating, showing the soldier that died fighting on the second day of the battle on Sickles' battle line. And notice he's lying behind a fence, and there's some stone there. It says 116th Pennsylvania. And then you look a little closer, and from an aerial perspective, and he's laying on his back. But notice that his leg's hanging over the wall. I was talking with my wife about this, and I mentioned to you earlier, she's an art professor, and she was saying that clearly the artist is making a point here that maybe the soldier fell over the wall as he was climbing the wall. We're left to wonder. But there he is lying there as a casualty of the second day of the battle. And it's really a form of Gothic revival. I've talked about that earlier, the idea of bringing back castles. And I'll show you, I mentioned sepulcher. Sepulcher is a stone carving. It's sometimes a casket, sometimes it's a building where a person's buried. Let's look at a medieval sepulcher. That's original Gothic. Notice how straight everyone is in that burial in a cathedral. That's Gothic. Well, the artist is clearly doing a spin on Gothic. And the person's not lying neatly. They have a leg hanging outside of the casket, essentially. And what's the artist trying to tell us here? Maybe you don't have to die perfectly and have everything perfectly and your arms folded over your chest perfectly to make it to the next life. As we look at heavens meet the earth. This is really a sepulcher is what it is. It's the artist trying to take a perfect sepulcher of the Middle Ages and show an imperfect sepulcher on the Gettysburg battlefield. The 78th and 102nd New York has embedded, this is over on Culp's Hill, in it the face of a what? A lion. Lions tend to remind us of courage, which is a virtue. Virtues, Aristotle believed that happiness is achieved through virtuous rational activities such as self-control, justice, courage, and generosity. Aristotle spent a lot of time thinking on this. Thomas Jefferson changed life, liberty, and property in the Declaration of Independence to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Why did he do that? Why did he mess with John Locke's words, life, liberty, and property? Some people believe it's because he wanted to remove property from the Declaration of Independence so that slavery couldn't be attached to the Declaration of Independence through the word property. So he changed life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Some people believe it has to do with Aristotle's original writings, which are foundational to the West, on happiness. How can somebody be happy? He believed that since humans are rational creatures and that they're happiest when they satisfy that rational thought through activities such as controlling your self-control, of having a justice system and living just, of courage in the face of death, and of generosity, hospitality. These are things that we all try to master. They're virtues. The ancient Greeks believed if we mastered these virtues, it allowed us to ascend from mortality to immortality, which is what the Soldiers' National Monument is telling us about liberty, who's ascended above the earth. And then Lincoln's Gettysburg Address Memorial is an Exedra. Exedras are places in ancient times where sacred conversations could be held. There were exedras built along Greek and Roman roads, and people would stop to rest. And notice there's a little bench that's here where you can sit and talk. And the curve of the stone and the stone itself, which is very hard, doesn't absorb sound, so it echoes when you walk into that curve and talk. Ancient people believed that the reason your voice echoed when you talked was not because you and I know it's just the granite or the stone that's being used. It's really like the Stonehenge is built with bluestone. And the bluestone was imported in from Wales. Why? Because it echoes. They thought in ancient times it was because there were spirits in the stones that were talking back to them. And it was sacred stone. Heavens meet the earth. And so there would be sacred conversations that would take place along the roadway between pilgrims. And that's what's really going on here with the Exedra of the Gettysburg Speech Memorial in the National Cemetery. Lincoln's bust is there. And by the way, Exedras kicked sound out toward you. So Lincoln is speaking to you with, and the words that are printed here on the plaque are speaking toward you. The sound goes forward. It echoes. And the idea is that it's sacred. It's not just that the stone is hard, but that it has spirits. In Grant Park, there is a monument to Lincoln on an Exedra, a very large one in Chicago, Illinois, put there in 1909. The New York State Auxiliary Monument near the Father Corby statue in the Pennsylvania Memorial also is an Exedra. If you step into it, you can drop a coin and it almost hurts your ears. The curvature of it kicks. They didn't understand sound waves traveled out in circles, but they learned that if they curved the stone in a certain way, and it was a certain makeup of stone in antiquity, if they used a certain stone and they made it in a curve, it would capture the sound and kick it back and echo. And again, that meant the stone was filled with something sacred. And all of the New York regiments and artillery units and the names of the commanders are on this monument. Notice there's an eagle there flying above it. Hagia Sophia, which was built as St. Sophia in Constantinople in the 300s AD, and then has since become a mosque with the fall of Constantinople in the 1400s. It's Istanbul, and now it's a museum. But notice how it's built with all of these exedras. See them? The sound echoes. And then the dome. When you leave here in a couple of minutes, you'll walk out right through a transition space. It's supposed to reset your mind between this part of the museum and the lobby. When you walk through, if you speak too loudly, it's going to hurt your ears. It has a dome. Domes are to magnify sound. Not only does an Exedra do that, but if you put a dome on it, a lot of cathedrals have those. And domes allow hot air to rise, heavens meet the earth, so it's cooler at ground level. There's a lot of domes in the Middle East. Father Corby gave absolution on the second day of the battle. He told the soldiers that if they prayed a sincere prayer for repentance of sins, that he would speak over them and that would be granted. And he did that for the Irish Brigade. Catholics and non-Catholics listened to him and knelt before they went. There was a really good account by St. Clair Mulholland of the 116th Pennsylvania. And he said that while Father Corby was praying, you could hear the cacophony of the battle in the background. He said it was like orchestra music or like Gregorian chants being sung in a cathedral. The music was going on in the background, but it was the sounds of battle. Then the great chain of being was how they thought back then. Before evolution, Darwin's ideas don't really gain traction until the 1890s, and are not introduced until the 1850s. People living in the Civil War didn't think in terms of there's Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, Java, hominid, and Homo sapien. They didn't think in terms of each species having levels of development. That was a foreign thought to people living at the time of the Civil War. Their point of reference was a great chain of being, and the hierarchy was there was God. It's based on virtue. God, then the angels, then humans. Higher level animals. That's why the lion is always portrayed as the king of the jungle and also portrayed as courage. And lower animals, plants, and rocks. And the monuments represent that hierarchy. Trajan's victory column, for instance, in Rome, depicts victory all around the column, all up and down this column. Trajan, the emperor, put himself at the top of the column. In the Middle Ages, they took Trajan down and put St. Peter up there. So St. Peter's there now. But on our battlefield, we have the state of Vermont And it's really inspired by Trajan's victory column. George Stannard is atop with a missing arm that he lost at Petersburg. And he commanded the Vermonters that repulsed Pickett's charge. And similar to how the victory of Trajan is described on all sides, Vermont's victory and its existence and its identity is described on all four sides. So you have to walk around all four sides. Ancient people believed there was something mystical to the ritual of walking around. You know the story of walking around Jericho 7 times and shouting, and then the walls fell. There are a lot of ancient stories similar to that of, if you can't do anything else, walk around, engage in an activity. So that's why you're to walk around the Vermont monument, just like you're to walk around Trajan's monument to see the whole story. The Acropolis is the highest point of the polis to be near heavens. That's why all your temples, statues, your treasury, your monuments to your greatest individuals, your holiest sites are on top of the Acropolis. There's many Acropolises throughout Greece. But the most famous, of course, is in Athens, and this is Athens, and you can see the Parthenon. Not unlike that, as we look at the heavens meeting the earth, the little round top is crowned with monuments. Some of them classical, some of them Gothic, but in any case, there's a parallel here. There's a parallel here that the monuments that we visit, and Lincoln borrowed from Pericles' speech to the Athenians in the Gettysburg Address when he said, "Our fathers." Pericles said the same things to the Athenians during the Peloponnesian Wars. And that shouldn't be lost on us, that the idea of going to the highest, holiest place and giving a speech like Lincoln did on Cemetery Hill, and it's covered with monuments, is not unlike the Acropolises of old, where all the monuments were placed. The State of Indiana monument over on Culp's Hill, Spangler Meadow, has 2 columns. One represents liberty, the other represents equality. And these 2 columns, it was put here in 1970, allow, like modern high-rise buildings, for sun to come through. Did you know that if you went to Chicago and they didn't have spaces between the high-rises, it gets really cold and windy there. And so buildings are now designed with a certain amount of space to allow sunlight through. And that's what this is symbolizing here. And if you look at the State of Indiana seal, which is on the monument, it's right here, up close, you'll notice a pioneer with an axe chopping down a tree, a buffalo running wild, and there's a sun in the background rising above the mountains. We know it's rising because the mountains in the background are where the folks that settled Indiana have come from. They had to cross those mountains. They're likely the Alleghenies. And the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. So it's rising between those 2 mountains, just like the sun rises in the east between these 2 columns. So you'll have to go out on a morning and watch how that happens. It means that the rising sun is always a promise that things are going to be better and you've moved on to greener pastures. Stonehenge does a similar thing. It draws the sun not only like these 2 columns on the State of Indiana monument, draws the sun in on December the 21st and June 21st in a way that comes through almost like turning on your laptop and it lights up. Or a modern day television, you turn it on and there's the electricity and there it is. And it tells you what time of the year it is, and so you should have your festival, and it means winter is setting in. The Florida monument over on West Confederate Avenue has altering heights to it. Why? It's the same concept, modern concept of don't build the buildings beside each other all the same height and block out all the sunlight for people walking along the streets. It's to allow the sunlight to come in, heavens and earth. And then our last topic, the high water mark. And the high water mark monument, where the area where Pickett's charge was repulsed, represents symbolic truth. It was put there about 30 years after the battle. Symbolic truth is an idea that has power over life and death. It basically means this is where the country shifted, where the rebellion was defeated, and where the idea of a nation really took hold. This spot. Now, what's going on here on a deeper level? Well, the monument was designed in front of oak trees. There's some debate as to whether Pickett's troops aimed for any trees. The Confederate counts don't talk about trees. But, so what's going on with the trees? Well, oak trees in ancient times were worshipped, not only by the Druids, but the Romans had their oracles. This is where you would go to get insight on how you should conduct your life and what the gods thought. They would build them and plant oaks around them. Oaks, you've ever heard of the mighty oak? Oaks are natural lightning rods. Oak trees are taller, have a thicker canopy, and their leaves are pointy, allowing a direct path for electricity. They were ancient versions of a Wi-Fi signal or an antenna. So if you build an oracle where you gain divine knowledge next to these oak trees and you see them being struck by lightning, that means you're connected between the heavens and the earth. And so whereas I turn on this cell phone, and if I have a Wi-Fi connection, I have images. In the same way, when lightning comes into the oak trees around the high watermark monument, the image that appears on the screen is the high watermark monument. That's the message. That's the oracle that we're to receive. And if you look at it closely, it's on an altar. Altars, in this case, this would be not a lectern or a podium. This is a sacrificial altar. Do you know there were over 5,000 soldiers, 1,500 Confederates, probably 1,500 Union, probably 3,800 Confederates, killed, wounded, or missing in 50 minutes, 50 minutes in Pickett's charge. Killed, wounded, or missing. And so there was a lot of sacrifice. And that altar, the trees have drawn this idea down from the sky, presented this altar to us, and on us is a word like a picture on our smartphone screen to tell us that this is where the South met its fate. Notice it says it's the high water mark of the rebellion, not the Confederacy. Rebellion means that the Confederacy was never legitimate. And Lincoln carefully chose those words for the Emancipation Proclamation, sent that message to Europe. This is a rebellion, stay out of it. Don't negotiate with the South. The Confederacy's not, they don't have a vote in the UN. They're not a nation among nations. This is a fight, internal fight. And so this is where the rebellion was put down, and that's what the monument represents, and the trees are conduits from that message from above. As you leave here today and walk out onto the battlefield, remember to look up along the skyline where heavens meet the earth at Gettysburg. Thank you. I think it's a little bit of both. But they were more aware of these religious themes. That's a good one. Again, it's a little bit of both, but to try to navigate with an answer, the first monuments that went up on the battlefield marked locations of units. For instance, the 2nd Massachusetts at Spangler Meadow. It wouldn't be till later that you have these grander theme memorials that are meant to inspire. I would start studying books on ancient classical monuments in Greece and Rome, in Egypt. Find material on that. Then you can better interpret the Civil War battlefield monuments. Now,
that you were pulling my leg on that one there.
Cool.